And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas from tonight already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, here I am, rock you like a hurricane. A hurricane, a literal flood of geopolitical action on the world stage, with all kinds of ramifications all around, and the gigantic magnet of pulling people in to war and all kinds of sort of bad choices along the way. And
there are no good choices.
Interesting. It comes to mind the war of all against all, which Rudolf Steiner warned us about, and which the defense contractors are happy to lead us into anything that gets them where they're going. But there are all kinds of players in the recent conflict, and we're seeing it pour out in every kind of different sort of way. We're looking at all sorts of videos and things that are coming out. It's interesting, isn't it? This thing, which has only happened a few days ago, and we have all this video footage and almost nothing about Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Incredible. So they jumped the Ukraine war, but also during this whole almost 2-year period now, very little has come out of that region.
Yep.
So you wonder about the propaganda capabilities of the whole thing. And of course, it's a tragedy for the people involved. And unfortunately, we have those types of groups operating on all sides, and the promotion of those groups, as we saw with ISIS. And remember, when you had that whole ISIS thing happening, they were using, requisitioned American and British stuff. Where'd they get it? And certainly their money flow had a tailpipe. Why wasn't that shut off? Somebody was running them, and it was freaking out all sides there. So very strange indeed. And it actually took the combined efforts of Russia and the United States in that period to do it. As that relationship, Russia and the United States, back during World War II, helped to defeat the Nazis. It's very interesting when you look at how these things play out, because almost from day one after World War II was over, we became natural enemies with the Soviet Union, and that led to many standoffs during the Cold War for years. And of course, President Kennedy getting us out of the hairiest situation, and President Reagan negotiating down very dangerous levels of nuclear weapons that we had in the 1980s. So there were some victories along the way. Whoever is orchestrating this, there's a lot of different reasons why they could be doing it. And there's a lot of things that don't add up in how the story is being presented about what's happening over there. But nonetheless, you have tons of civilians on the ground experiencing really difficult circumstances. So we're going to try to get tonight through all the chaos to the kind of fundamental idea of leading with liberty and bringing forward that liberty and how it came to be. Because I'll tell you, when you read the stories of the Founding Fathers, which is, I think, a big piece that they want us to forget with the current corporate regime and the deep state, you find that they were up against the wall over and over again and under tremendously difficult circumstances, pulled off a revolution that shocked the world. And so we're going to look at that tonight. We're going to look at it through the figure of Thomas Jefferson and some very interesting things that come to light on the mystical side related to Jefferson, including his association with the Rosicrucians, which is a more modern discovery, and also some very, very interesting things about Edgar Cayce and his relationship to Jefferson reincarnated. Yes, I said Jefferson reincarnated. It's interesting to note that, the psychic grandfather that Cayce had, who was such an inspiration for him, and who, died when he was very young, actually, Edgar Cayce was with him when he died. He was bringing his water out to a stream to drink, and the water, the horse threw him and he drowned. And Edgar was 5 years old. He couldn't save him. And then he would see him. You'd have these kind of apparitions of his grandfather for years. And it's quite interesting because his name was Thomas Jefferson Cayce.
Oh, interesting.
So we have another kind of link there through the names. And I'm going to get into some very interesting names tonight with Jefferson and his crossover. And again, Cayce right in the middle of all this, living his humble life. But, Cayce in Virginia, Jefferson in Virginia, parts of it are going to overlap and make sense here. There's a fabulous story about these historical personages who showed up during the 40 some odd years of Cayce's readings. And it wasn't like there was a famous personage every other day. It's just once in a while, somebody really major would come on the scene. I was doing an interesting study about all the people related to the Wizard of Oz, who some 40 people related to the Wizard of Oz came to Edgar Cayce for readings between the, in that 1.5 year period when they were making it. So that's pretty incredible when you think about it. Somebody deep in there knew something about Cayce and his abilities. And I think we look at Cayce tonight in a very interesting way as a connecting thread for these mystery schools through time and their kind of setup for the 21st century through Steiner and through Cayce and different movements like the Gurdjieff movement. They're all talking and laying a foundation for the 21st century. And that's what Mystery October has been all about. And I want to remind everyone before we go any further tonight that we are going to be taking your questions in the second half of this special report. And this is American Prophecy, Mystery Schools, Back to the Future, Cayce, Jefferson, and the Rosicrucians. And we'll go a couple of hours with you tonight. And in the second half of that special report, we're going to take your questions. You can ask those questions now, and Miss Olivia is putting those together. Before I go any further, of course, Miss Olivia, what's going on out there?
Actually, everybody seems to be in a much better mood than I would have expected. I want to say that I'm just sort of looking forward to this episode because, I'm just feeling how much I really love my country, and I'm so grateful for America.
Absolutely.
As it's slipping away from us all. So I think it's important that we talk about it and we value it.
Absolutely. Yeah. America is so important, and the founding of America is crucial, and that kind of foundation of the mystery schools involvement with it. People talk about the Masons and all this stuff. And it's interesting. If you go into the background of some of the major characters, like Jefferson, for example, he doesn't have any association with Masonry. And but certainly some of them do. But this is the crisscross going on in that period. And so it's not just like a bunch of Masons got together and formed the country. No, it's a very deep mystical strain, and it is the Rosicrucian school is the one I can identify the most that's involved. But we're going to get into some very interesting telltale signs around that. I want to say this also about Jefferson, which is you can really look at him as the kind of arch intellectual of the group, but he of the founding fathers, this is the guy who was there pushing for the Bill of Rights. This is the guy looking to articulate the Constitution, the language in exact terms. And there's been a lot of revisionist history about Jefferson. And if you really look at his life, it's remarkable. What's interesting is when you get into the more mystical side, you're going to find that Cayce had actually said that Jefferson had been Alexander the Great. And for me, that makes a lot of sense. When you see like you kind of learn the lesson, but you still have the ability and the mission to organize these nations. But, by the time he's Thomas Jefferson, he has more wisdom. And, you can take the connotation about his past lives either way, but I'm going to use them tonight as kind of a way in to the mystical side of what's going on there. I also want to remind you, if you're new around here, to make sure you go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch with each other with the incredible censorship that we have going on. And it's interesting to me, that the censorship is at such a fever pitch now, and they're trying to drown everything out with war talk. They sort of ran out of gas in the Ukraine one, and they're amping up this tragic situation over in the Middle East. But what we have to remember is all the way through this, that America and the guiding principles of America are crucial, as is the 2024 election. And we can't take our eye off the ball. After all, if they're going to try to involve us and sink us into this World War III scenario, which there's a lot of factors going on, and I may do a separate report involving some of this moves that we've made, um, in relation to Iran and some of the things, the coalitions that are forming on that side, with Venezuela, North Korea, Russia. So there's something in there is going to have to give, because the deep state is mounting all of our resources. And, certainly if I read their signs correctly, they want to send in actual boots on the ground in Ukraine and in the Middle East. So these things need to be kind of preemptive and in thought, in mind first, identified on this side. So we're going to go mystically tonight, and I'll probably do a more kind of straight up political style report coming up. And it's great to be here with so many of you tonight in the Ideas Room, and this very special X-Series report, American Prophecy Mystery Schools, Back to the Future. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, the temperature out there.
Thomas Ball says, I wept at the feet of the Thomas Jefferson statue in D.C. after 9/11 protest. I go there often. This time I was overcome. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God.
Yeah, and these are great things that he discovered. He was able to, they understood the separation of church and state, but they didn't remove spiritual concepts from the state. This is a crucial thing. The idea of church and state that they were getting away from and that they had been oppressed by was, the corrupt Church of England and King Charles. And so this is, King George, and the things that were going on in relation to the revolution. George was in fact doing these false flags against himself, blowing up his own ships and blaming it on the colonists, and all to get a greater presence and more control here. And they saw there was no way out. But what's interesting is, in their success, which, the founding fathers were incredibly, the odds against them were dramatic. And they had this, basically the world's top military against them. And they had formed a very ragtag set of alliances in these 13 colonies. And the way that I look at this, not only that, but the British had also got the Hessians involved. They were using them as kind of contract killers. And they were converting certain Native American troops to their side, so they were using all kinds of forces against the colonists. And the dramatic outcome of the whole thing, and, of course, the British came back in 1812 to try to torch the place again. But the dramatic outcome of this is to understand there's a kind of a David and Goliath theme in there, with the founding fathers. And I think putting forward the kind of patriotism and understanding of real patriotism in the case of America, not just kind of mindless flag waving or that kind of thing, but more, what is America about? What was it founded on? What is the nature of freedom, freedom of speech, and how those things have been violated by a technocratic elite? And that, that level of terrorism from the corporate level, we also need to look at as we go in here. And for some of the real terrorism that exists in the world, a lot of these groups that operate on the technocratic side have used this thing to exploit. Think 9/11, when we certainly had genuine terrorists who wanted to take down the United States, but there was no way in hell they could defeat, the air power and the air force of the United States. So that whole story and the use of those terrorists leaves history wanting. Those things didn't happen the way that they said they happened. And the continuity of government program.
You mean there's something wrong with the official story?
Exactly. But when we look at this, we have to get our heads wrapped around the idea that they tell us one thing and they show you one thing. And we've been understanding it more and more, that behind that facade is a narrative that's operating for a particular purpose. Now, when we go back and we look at Professor Scott's claims, in his research, it's quite interesting because he talks about these deep events. And the deep events are a crucial thing for us to understand, because it is this covert government that steps in and interferes with the affairs of the overt government, the public state. and then retreats back to its position, but they're trying to achieve a policy change. And in this case, the policy change could be, related to the rules of war and the things that they're trying to accomplish. And what I've seen signs of with what they're trying to do is to outlaw speech under this idea relating to terrorism, and then actually promoting terrorist speech. So, this is there are levels, back and forth levels, and through the looking glass we go on this. But we're going to get into it tonight, and we're going to look basically at how this relates to us on the setup of America and American prophecy. So that's what we're looking at tonight. The other thing I want to mention in relation to all this is a lot of people have been asking me about the address. Some people want to sign up apparently using checks, and I want to get this out of the way now. It is, if you have a pen and paper ready, it's Dark Journalist, 1770 Massachusetts Avenue, number 238, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02140. And I just saved myself about 50 emails there because I keep getting them that way. But yeah, well, you can certainly use a check or a money order and direct it to that address. And we're very happy for all your support. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Thomas Ball continued. He said, JFK had all the Nobel laureates around the dinner table at the White House and said, quote, "This is the greatest collection of minds ever to sit at this table, except when Thomas Jefferson dined
Sat there
here
alone." That's a great quote. He knew, and he quoted him often, as did Reagan and some other great presidents. There's something very interesting when we get into, I'm going to go right into some of these aspects relating to Jefferson and secret societies. Now, Jefferson, again, is the person who's really pursuing the language in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution. And you can really say that the setup, the foundation of those, the American Revolution, of course, it rests with Washington and Franklin and others, but Jefferson is the kind of the arc intellectual mind behind it, and he leads it. And it's very interesting when we look over the many things that he accomplished, because, of course, he was president, but it is his role in Virginia that he seems to be the most proud of, and the setup of Monticello. Some interesting things there in the architecture of Monticello. But I'm going to read a couple of things that come out of this. It is the Founding Fathers and Secret Societies, and they're quoting Russell Arundel. Everybody's Pixelated from 1937. Isn't that interesting? But I'm going to start with this. The Rosicrucians claim that Washington and Franklin as members, but do not provide irrefutable evidence. In Jefferson's case, however, Dr. Spencer Lewis, former imperator of the Rosicrucian order, introduces a piece of substantial evidence. I want to say this about the Rosicrucian order. There's kind of a public overlay. It's like a reflection of what the Rosicrucians are all about. It's not really like the actual Rosicrucian mystery school is accessible. It's not. It's so deep in kind of underground system of culture. But there are often, these kind of, I don't want to say caricature, but they're fronts, they're echoes of what the teaching is. And
they're valuable. Right?
Oh, there's no question about it.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I refer to some of the deeper ones, like Steiner's work with anthroposophy and spiritual science and the Theosophical Society, and Annie Besant and others. Those are public mystery schools. So they do have the deep structure, even though they're public. With the Rosicrucians, they've carried the tradition. They know that there's a tradition back there. And so they're kind of reestablishing the tradition. But it's not like we can say, oh, hey, this is somebody who's, part of that, connected directly to that mystical Rosicrucian tradition, which went underground rather immediately in the 15th century and seemed to resurface in the spiritualism craze that swept America in the 19th century and became kind of a heavy presence in the political structure, working, um, to develop and kind of move the culture forward. But I think if you look at Rudolf Steiner's work, you're going to find that he was working with the Rosicrucians, and you're going to find that a very heavy influence on Edgar Cayce's work as Rosicrucian. To find the Rosicrucians at work with Thomas Jefferson and the setup of the country is quite fascinating indeed. All right. So Lewis found among Jefferson's papers some strange-looking characters that other researchers had assumed were a code Jefferson had invented. They'd looked at these papers for 200 years and were just like, oh, this is part of a internal thing. But what he says is, quote, I recognized it as one of the old Rosicrucian codes used for many years before Thomas Jefferson became a Rosicrucian, and still to be found in many of the ancient Rosicrucian secret manuscripts. I have submitted this code to several cryptographers, and none have yet been successful in identifying it. Mr. Daniels of Concord, Massachusetts, commented 1974 now, I have taken several tries at the code with no success for the standard ones. You have hit upon something nobody else seems to know about. Jefferson's visions of America can be translated as expansionist. His Louisiana Purchase was not only a landmark of the development of the American nation, but an expression of the empire for liberty. I found, digging around, I found the actual code that they located. This is the direct Rosicrucian mystery code. And what's interesting is apparently it's related all the way back to the Chaldeans. And we know the Chaldeans had this remarkable astronomical and astrological outlook, and they incorporated that into their belief systems. And it's very interesting because, when you get into that story just a little bit, you find that the setup of, and I'll read the architecture part, but with the setup for the Thomas Jefferson various ancient architectural elements involved in what he created actually incorporate a lot of this very interesting Rosicrucian architecture. So I'll take a little piece of this. Jennings C. Wise theorized that within Jefferson's architectural design of the university are hidden the teachings of the mystery schools and secret societies. Realizing the curriculum could be altered, Wise suggests, Jefferson embedded the philosophy of the mystical tradition in the bricks and mortar of the university so that its design would convey a philosophy free from dogma and superstition. Jefferson unites the ancient architectural elements of the rotunda and the rectangular academic hall, which symbolize heaven. The rotunda is used in the Chaldean planet tower, which is called the House of the Seven Spheres. Interesting, too, when we think about the eighth sphere, and here we have the Chaldeans' House of the Seven Spheres. And the earth, the four-cornered rectangle, they're used together in one structure, symbolizes the union of heaven and earth. How often do we see that, for example, in Washington, D.C.? And again, that D.C., the District of Columbia. In Columbia, this kind of very interesting setup character guiding America, kind of like the first Statue of Liberty and the original name for America. Pure mystery school aspects going on there. That's the University of Virginia that is set up there. And he wanted it set up after kind of the School of Athens type of idea. Now, it's interesting if you go into the way that architecture was set up and what he was drawing from. And this is an interesting text. It's actually Zechariah Sitchin's text going into the Chaldean setup and the story of Inanna. But he talks about this seven spheres and the layout for this. I'm just going to read a little bit of this, of what Inanna is wearing. And this will give us some key back through to what Jefferson was a part of. And we're going to expand and learn deeply just how important this character is to moving forward that mystical vision through the founding of America. So of the seven, one is the Shugara. This is something that Inanna puts on her head. Two is a measuring pendant, and these are on her ears, so pendants. Three is the chains of small blue stones around her neck. Four is the twin stones on her shoulders. Whenever we get into this instantly echoes of Cayce's version of the Firestone, which comes up tonight. A golden cylinder in her hands, straps clasping her breast, the pala garment clothed around her body. This is the symbolical representation of what Jefferson put into the University of Virginia and may relate. I'm still looking through the different interpretations of this script, which is the Rosicrucian script, but we might have something kind of remarkable if there's a crisscross that's really opened up about this script and the mystery school connection of Jefferson. Now, a lot of people, just wanted to crack the script and figure out what was he involved in. But what I want to do is take it a little bit deeper and say, there may be things vouchsafed deep inside the architecture and the setup of America. And we've seen these different things, and they're always attributed to, this is a Masonic ceremony, et cetera, which is understandable because of how the esoteric Masonic aspects are laid out in the District of Columbia. What I want to do is imagine that for the most perilous time America needs to go through, say what's coming up, that there are certain aspect and certain mystery center symbols which are meant to kind of open or awaken during this period. And that's why we have this unusual story of Edgar Cayce and Thomas Jefferson, which I'm going to get into next. Everyone, you're watching The American Prophecy. This is Mystery School's Back to the Future. Thomas Jefferson, Edgar Cayce, and some of these deep prophecies taking us into the 21st century. We're going to be taking your questions here. And like I said, we'll go for about another hour or so tonight. We're just doing a special report, and we'll return with the X series again next week. I have a very interesting special set of episodes coming up for you for this mystery October. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Chris Lothian says, did those 7 spheres have anything to do with the 7 primary powers written about in the Egyptian Book of the Dead?
Well, that's very interesting because you have this law of 7 embedded in so many of these systems. Tesla talks about it. Gurdjieff certainly talks about it. And there's some magic correlation, of course, in the chakras, the system of the chakras. And, there's some dispute about the amount of chakras, whether it's 7 or 12. But it is, there are mathematical formula which are laid out, whether it's through the musical scales or in architecture or in measurements or in geometric placements for these ancient buildings, which are supposed to speak to a group that has arrived on the scene. And it's not in, hey, we expect our language to hold up over, 10,000 years since the pyramid was built. But that group, once they achieve the level of science and they achieve the level of mathematics, can have that awakening that we've placed inside of these objects for them. This is the kind of way that steganography works. And we're going to get into that tonight. And it's interesting when we look at the figure of Edgar Cayce, because Cayce himself is on the surface, he's, of course, the Sleeping Prophet. We've done shows on his various Atlantean aspects, which are probably the only aspect that's largely, I don't want to say it's ignored, but they don't go deep in the Cayce books. And, I like all the people who write about Cayce and the organization that brings his work forward, the Edgar Cayce Foundation, the ARE. You can't ever fault those people. They're doing great. But I think in general, there's just an institutional fear around the Cayce work when it comes to Atlantis, because you're dealing then with science fiction concepts practically. But he was talking about this in the 20s and 30s. And he was talking about the incredible technology that the Atlanteans possessed and how basically through reincarnating, those Atlanteans were back and they were ready to kind of create havoc all over again to face themselves. And
it's not hard to believe.
Well, you kind of feel like you're right in the middle of it, right? For me,
tortured yet again.
Well, it's interesting because, Cayce doesn't say that we're all Atlanteans. It seems like this particular group comes in and they rise to power. And then at one point, for better or for worse, they come down on one side or the other. In the case of Atlantis itself, it's quite fascinating because and I have some Cayce readings on Atlantis. But basically, the fundamental idea and the fundamental story is, if you go through something like Plato, is that there was this incredible seafaring kingdom that was, uh, far superior to ancient Egypt or any of the others, and that they dominated, and that, in the words of Plato, they angered the gods. And that's how we get into the situation with the Atlanteans and the great destruction that takes them out in one day and night. But there's a lot of very interesting things that Plato was talking about there. And of course, the fact that he got the story from Solon, who got it from his relative, the Egyptian priest. So, and this is a story that says, oh, you guys think you're the cat's meow now here in Greece, but let me tell you, this stuff with the Atlanteans, this goes back 9,000 years, and they were talking around 400 BC. So when we start to look at how history was presented and how Cayce sort of messed with the timeline on what was going on back there, traditional archaeology had the pyramids and the Sphinx around 2500 BC. And it was very loose the way that they came up with that, because they did not have real evidence that Cheops, the pharaoh, was the one who created the pyramid, just that he was identified with kind of a great renaissance around the pyramid. And there was no idea of him being buried in the chamber. There's no hieroglyphs that said anything about him. And later, in the early 20th century, late 19th century, all these guys were competing, and that's how you got King Tut's tomb and all that. But we have a fake out where one guy goes in there and he paints these hieroglyphs on. Later on, they found the notes from this guy, and he was trying to figure out which name he should use and how he should paint the hieroglyphs. So that's a total fake out. There are no hieroglyphs that identify Cheops with the pyramid, the Great Pyramid. And one of the things that Cayce was talking about in the development of the Great Pyramid, it ushers in a new age. So in 10,500 BC, it's a huge change. Atlantis is gone. The advanced groups and the advanced technology, they've come into Egypt, and they've come into some other places like South America, like the Pyrenees. And when we get into what Cayce is trying to tell us, he's basically saying, look, that massive, network of firestones through what he called the two-eye stone, it's Tuaoi, that was something that they used to power all of the things that they could do. At a certain point, he said the Atlanteans could go anywhere in the universe. So this is kind of hard for us to imagine, but we're getting into space ourselves. Well, the Atlanteans and the kind of matter and the depth of the matter was different. So they were here and physical, yes, but they were kind of half astral, etheric, half physical. So a lot of the things that they could do through thought gradually over time, by the time you get into ancient Egypt, they're starting to harden, and things are starting to get more and more dense. So it's easier, I think, for us to understand them as half physical and half on the etheric plane. And I think there are times when that's why we get so much of the message of the spiritual aspect of the Atlanteans, because when you're getting into psychic aspects and the things they could do with their mind, they're a very fleshed out civilization in physicality. Make no mistake about it. I mean, they're the ones, after all, who built the pyramids, etc. But the entire inspiration is coming from their connection to this other level of other realm, I guess, of activity. Now, what Cayce is trying to present for 10,500 BC is that the Sphinx and the pyramid represent the culmination of saving the knowledge of the initiates from Atlantis directly by placing the knowledge of the two-eye stone, the history of Atlantis, their spiritual development, everything, into these three separate halls of records. Now, the main, they're all the same, but the main one that we know about is the Sphinx, and under the paw of the Sphinx is the entryway, according to Edgar Cayce. Over in the hot zone in Bimini, right off the coast of Bimini, near what would be the Bimini wall there, that's the Poseidon temple that Cayce says is rising. And it's interesting because earth changes are part of the awakening of this period that we're in. So while you're seeing all these things go off everywhere when it relates to wars and, you know, all these incredible weather things that are being interfered with, and, you know, the COVID op and things of this nature, it's all the setup. You know, we're entering into a period where there are going to be massive changes. And what's happening is, on the man-made side, you know, these people are playing a kind of a Frankenstein game, trying to alter things radically as we head into this period, probably as a way to stay ahead of it for themselves. But nonetheless, the results, as we've seen, have been tragic, shall we say. But I think what we need to keep in mind is that the message of the awakening, I'm going to read a little bit about how we're going to find this information. The other place where it's stashed is in the Yucatan, and this is the Temple of Iltar. So Cayce talks about that, and that is near a pyramid, by a temple pyramid. So we have these three different record halls. And the Hall of Records in Egypt, there's been a major focus on. People have attempted to get through the gauntlet of the antiquities department over there in Egypt, which is connected directly to the government, and find this out. So you can find studies about audio, you know, samples and all kinds of things, testing that they were doing that go back to the 1960s and 70s. So this has been an ongoing thread, and once in a while it comes back into that public consciousness. And I think that we're entering again a period where people are apprehending the mystery of Cayce's readings around Atlantis. How does that relate to Thomas Jefferson? I'm going to tell you as we get into the next phase of the special report, American Prophecy and the Mystery Schools, Back to the Future, with Cayce and Thomas Jefferson. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Atlantis Rising says the mystery schools have lost their way and now run amok, missed and lost from the old ways.
Well, yeah, I don't agree with that because, no, I think that the mystery schools are moving to shape the culture, and they have their kind of ambassadors into that culture over and over again. It's interesting. I always go back to the story that Steiner tells about 1920, about how embedded, this is 100 years ago now, the mystery school, you know, adherents are in the political process, you know, and they describe them as right hand and left hand. And it's very interesting because, you know, this whole thing about left hand is very interesting. It's funny because some of the great initiates are supposed to be left-handed, but the way that the right and left-hand paths were a way to describe where the it didn't have anything to do with who was right-handed or left-handed. And just like the Great White Brotherhood doesn't have anything to do with the color of a person's skin, these are concepts that lift way beyond any kind of superficial thinking along that line. What we get, though, is this idea that there are two groups, and that the left-hand path group has the same knowledge base in the mysteries as the group that wants to move the culture forward, the Rosicrucian style groups. And so you could associate them more with a Crowley style group, although I think that they go even, you know, much more off the rails than someone like Crowley. So when we look at that, we have to understand that in that political process, you're instantly up against these groups. So it might not be the most superficial member, you know, but in that deep political process, the one that we're talking about, you're dealing with a war of the secret societies versus the mystery schools. I think that's a really kind of the appropriate way to look at it. And if anything, I would say that the mystery schools are the things that have kept culture together when there's been kind of the madness of war. And, you know, if you just look back over the wars of the 20th century and all the destruction and the challenges to civilization, how do you get through that? You know, if you go all the way back to Egypt and Atlantis, the culture that they lost when you go into the supposed Dark Ages, I mean, you're losing everything for thousands of years, and it's kept just by small groups of kind of esoteric initiates, and they hold that knowledge through time. And then we have this wonderful, amazing renaissance when you get to the 19th century and into the 20th century. And that's where we get the foundations, so that information that literally would have gotten someone burned at the stake, just a few hundred years ago, is now available for anyone to plug into. That's remarkable. That's the period that we're in. And, as we apprehend things like space and going to other planets and things of this nature, we are in an incredibly expansive phase. You go back 100 years, you still have some horse and buggy action, even though the cars are coming on strong. So yeah, I mean, massive, massive change. Yeah. What do you got?
Scarlet Fire says pure philosophy has been replaced by the teachings of clever intellectuals with no mystical understanding of life. People have ceased to see the universe as a source of wonder and no longer revere it as work of God. Spirituality has come to be dismissed by science as primitive superstition.
Oh, absolutely. When you see all the kind of World Economic Forum people and, crazy Harari and guys like that, they've been trained intellectually to do all kinds of things. Or I think of an economist like Paul Krugman or something, who is such an educated idiot. And he's like, we're doing great with inflation, just don't count food. It's fundamental. But it is this getting educated to a point, because what it is, you're actually mutating the being, you're imbalancing it by just appealing to its, pure intellect. They're losing their sense of emotion, their balance, their compassion for humanity. It's just intellectual stimulation. And that is, that's another side of this Frankenstein aspect. And Steiner refers to that. That's the Ahrimanic force that we're up against. And we see it all the time in the technological world that we've moved into, because this is the period, this Ahrimanic period. And it's a major challenge, but it's possible to take that mechanization of society and actually lift society up with it. So one way or another, we're going to learn, hopefully. It's without too much trial and tribulations. Now, that's why I think this story of Jefferson and Thomas Jefferson Davis, which comes up tonight, it's long been sort of theorized in the Cayce readings that we go through a series of lifetimes, and there's a cycle to that when you come back to a certain lifetime, you actually come back with the people you incarnated with before. And
soul groups.
Soul groups, exactly. If you go back, pretty much all the traditions had reincarnation, and Christianity had reincarnation. This is what's important to realize. And it was removed. So it's not that by believing in reincarnation, you are somehow shunning Christianity. You're not. It's just that Christianity, mystical Christianity split off from Christianity. And they decided, we're not going to include this. Just like they decided, we're not going to include, those books of Enoch. And the people making those decisions are human beings. But the actual doctrine itself is inspired by something else. So when you get over time, by the time you get down to the real story, and it's not an excuse, but I think it is important for us to understand that, by the time the Bible has gone through 2,000 years, and then we get into massive printing press, and then you have the King James version and how different that is from the Gutenberg Bible, and et cetera. You're already dealing with splintered pieces of information. What's remarkable is how intact the New Testament is. And I think there's a great deal for us to glean from that, including the period that we're in and all the things that we hear about, well, you're going to need the mark of the beast in order to transact. Well, it's so fascinating because we're rolling directly into this biometric society, which I'll tell you, seems a heck of a lot like that, doesn't it? So Cayce, when he is doing his medical readings and helping people, and there's a long, very interesting story about how he develops that. But suffice to say, he arrives at a place where he is also now giving life readings. So beyond just diagnosing people at a distance, which was a remarkable ability that he had. Here he is going now and giving people kind of a soul reading, and their past lives are coming through, and he's seeing them and how they relate to the current life. And so this is the crucial kind of karmic understanding, and so much of the literature that comes after Cayce, because Cayce really doesn't explode till the 1960s, which is he's already been dead for 2 decades because he died in 1945. But there is this remarkable set of books. The Sleeping Prophet by Jess Stern is really the one that is the bestseller that sets it off. And all the Cayce stuff just influences the culture off the charts at that point. And so you have all of these, kind of similar things popping up. Seth speaks, and reincarnation becomes something that people understand on a kind of practical level. Well, when Cayce is dealing with these readings, sometimes he will go back to the Atlantean lifetimes, and sometimes he'll be associated with the people who come in for the reading. I think that gets into very interesting territory. I don't know how many people out there have had past life readings, but it is an interesting, aspect of yourself to explore. And it's kind of one of those things that either you're into it or you're not. But in any case, what was happening with Cayce on this is he runs across the soul who was Thomas Jefferson as an infant, and he gives a reading. And in fact, it is Gladys Davis, who is his lifelong secretary, who compiles the reading. And if you go to that wonderful ARE now, you're going to be surrounded by the readings that she set up with the numbering system and all the rest. We have to remember that Cayce was giving readings for a decade before Gladys Davis was around. So there's so many readings in circulation that we've never gotten our hands on. And that opens up quite a bit, including the 2 readings, one for Nikola Tesla and one for Thomas Edison. We know on the record that each one got readings. Wouldn't you love to see those? But unfortunately, there was no Gladys Davis there recording and compiling them. So in this reading for Thomas Jefferson, Cayce now, going over the past lives of Jefferson, is giving us a message here. He says, yet if there are the developments through the environment, it may be seen that this entity may become more important in the affairs of the world than this entity was in its previous experience as and has been to America, Thomas Jefferson. Now, this is very interesting because, Jefferson leaves this incredible imprint on society. And here is Cayce saying, you've got somebody who's going to basically transform the world right now. So when you look at this from a mystery school perspective, they actually do reincarnate in these cycles where they come back to information to awaken them from the kind of slumber of incarnation to let them know, aha, this is my mission in life. And there's a number of different cases like this. For example, Steiner, when he's having all these strange things, Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian mystic, when he's a boy, has these incredible encounters. He sees this woman and, she appears to him out of nowhere, and then she disappears, and he goes and he tells his mother about it, and he realizes, that's the grandmother who committed suicide. And, the different things that Steiner could see as a child don't make sense to him, and it makes him kind of an outcast. Very much the same story with Cayce. But what happens in Steiner's case is, he's kind of introduced to this gardener, and the gardener is one of these masters who reawakens him to his past lives. Well, here we have Cayce being the person who's waking Thomas Jefferson up. And it's very interesting. And the story doesn't have the ending, maybe, that, we all would have wanted. But it's very interesting, his life journey. And one of the things that I did when I visited the ARE, you can do this online now, is actually look at the different letters that this person left behind. Because what happens to him is he becomes very eclectic, this reincarnated person. He becomes a beatnik. He becomes somebody who travels around. He becomes a hippie. And he's incredibly articulate. He's smart. but he doesn't amount to very much. And so this great promise that he's brought in with through the Cayce readings becomes almost strange vacuum of what this leader would have done. Nonetheless, there are some very interesting things that went on here that I'm going to get into as we go deep here into American prophecy. This is the Special X Series report, Mystery Schools, Back to the Future, Edgar Cayce, and Thomas Jefferson. We're going to be taking your questions here in about 20 minutes, and then we're going to go to about 11 o'clock with you tonight. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Okay. Liberty Power says, question. Dolores Cannon, with her past live regressions, was told about the Earth dividing into two Earths. A good thing. We move into a higher energy. Did Cayce have that type of reading?
Yeah, this was interesting, and it's interesting about Dolores Cannon. I spent a lot of time with her material. I met her, and she was very interesting. But it seemed like a lot of these concepts were like, oh, hey, there's new souls incarnating. There's going to be two levels of Earth, and it was just the concepts, and it didn't seem like there was anything to dig into. It was just, and the process she was using was very much like the process that they used to extract information from Cayce, which was to put him into a hypnotic state. But there are a lot of differences there in terms of how you can access it. For example, somebody whose subconscious is very advanced, when they go into that state, they have access to the Akashic record. They can bring back fascinating information. If it's just somebody who has, kind of a passing interest in the subject, maybe you'll get something interesting, but you might not get the kind of depth that you would get, so it depends. And so I think with a lot of that type of information, I think it's interesting, but I haven't sensed that level of depth that I would place on the same level of like the mysteries, for example. And I know it's a hard thing to do, and everyone has to try on the level that they're on, but I've never felt anything too advanced in the canon's work.
I mean, it's really popular in kind of the New Age, this idea of New Earth. But I just heard someone recently say that that what it is that we have access, greater access to the fifth dimension. Which
yes.
I can, enough time has gone by now that I can feel things shifting in that with meditation
Yes.
or not. I think we're all receiving these cosmic rays. We're all having an upgrade. And it's kind of like turbulence before we hit the higher level of flying, of altitude. And I don't know about us splitting into a lower Earth and a higher Earth, but I think certainly that we are getting access to greater consciousness. And, I hate to say it, but with everybody doing ayahuasca and other psychedelics, there's that too. It's that, if one, there's a certain kind of a 100th monkey effect. If all these people are having access to higher consciousness by taking psychedelics or entheogens, I think all of us would be impacted on some level.
True. I mean, I can't recommend those things. That's an interesting point as well. But when I talked to Graham Hancock about it, and he's done some 200 ayahuasca things, and people have had remarkable experiences with it. And I think it does represent for a lot of different people, elevated experience. There's no question about it. What I learned in my study of the mystery schools was that you have to, that there aren't any shortcuts to this type of information. So you have to bring it. The best way to do it is to bring it through your own efforts. But certainly, as you said, whether it comes from the psychedelic 60s on to now, you get people experimenting, and so much of that comes through the culture. I think when you think about some of the great musical minds or artistic minds, that's exactly true. One thing I will say that does match up with the Dolores Cannon thing is, and I always enjoyed the kind of going into the Nostradamus part, which is Dolores Cannon talked about this idea of splitting into two Earths, and the people would go into a certain future, and these other people would go into another future. Ouspensky, who was in the profile that we did last week of Gurdjieff, Ouspensky was fascinating. It's New Model of the Universe. It's a wonderful book. But they asked him during this back and forth of the fourth way questions when he would do these lectures. They said, how can you really develop yourself in the midst of these conditions like World War II? And, as an individual going through all this, you're just kind of getting by. Like, how do I even build in any kind of spiritual inspiration? And what happened is pretty interesting, is that Ouspensky said, well, as you are working on these things, conditions about you change, as if to suggest that you'll actually find yourself in a different reality the deeper that you go with this. So that does suggest that there are levels of awareness that take you into what would be defined as a different reality. So there is some kind of crossover there. Absolutely. You got anything else?
Well, I got a lot.
Okay.
We could just, go straight to Q&A. So Terry Doherty earlier said, I don't get reincarnation. And Najat Madri said, humanity has to learn from its mistakes. That's how consciousness evolves. The possibility of the mystery schools holding back when things go amok is a test for humanity.
Uh-huh.
And one more thing. So Ogum5 says, I've said this previously, but it's the failure of humanity to have faith in itself as a responsive co-creator, which has caused us so much unrelenting grief. I mean, a lot of this, what is the nature of a test? Why do we have it as an evolving species, right? This is what reincarnation is all about. It's testing us. I think it's a place you can see it as where we experience fear, where we shrink rather than rise up in courage and and belief in ourselves. I mean, on a very basic level, that's something we can all do.
Well, absolutely. Here's the thing that I think is worthwhile to consider when it comes to reincarnation. And reincarnation shouldn't be something that you trip over. If it's something you either resonate with it or you don't. What I can tell you is that the mystery school traditions from the Cayce work, Steiner's work, Theosophy, they include it. It's a central aspect if you go into the Rosicrucians and the whole thing. It's an awareness level that was brought back, that was left out previously, and the mystery schools on their side went back and forth quite a bit. As a matter of fact, there's an effort after it's let out initially to put it back in the bottle, but you can't do it because there is this sense that, well, if people think they have tons of lives to work these things out, they won't work on it here. It's not actually true. I think the deeper point, when you're ready to understand that there's a developmental level that comes through various incarnations, and then that gets us into esoteric Christianity. That is what we're speaking of when we speak of Cayce or Steiner or the mystery schools. So, for example, in that cosmology, Christ incarnates on earth 30 times. He incarnates as Enoch. He incarnates through these various lifetimes to be able to become Jesus. And the mystery schools set up to create Jesus's lifetime are the Essenes. And the Essenes were only really understood after we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they contain, kind of these very deep skills, very deep practices that having to do with numerology, astrology, and other things. And in the Cayce work, John the Baptist is an Essene, and his mother is an Essene. And what happens at a certain point is when Cayce's looking back at Jesus' activity with the Essenes, he splits off from them because, his own realizations run deeper. And the Essenes themselves split off from the Pharisees and all the kind of traditional religion. So it's quite interesting when you get into it. One of the things that Cayce identified was that the Essenes in that mystery school were set up both as male and female. You had female priestesses and you had male priests. No one knew that at the time in relation to the Jewish mysteries. And in 1947, 2 years after Cayce dies, they discover the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so much of the Cayce work comes alive. So there again, we have Cayce penetrating through time by reading that Akashic record. So, again, the reincarnation aspect is just it's important in the mysteries, but it isn't something which, if you're not, if you don't believe in it, somehow it's just a different way of approaching things. That's the best way I would look at it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so Edgar Cayce, what is his take on self development in isolation versus self development within a group?
Well, he starts off on the individual level.
Mhm.
There's no question. And but he did the Search for God groups. He was a Sunday school teacher after all. He knew all about group dynamics and that kind of support level. But he always started with the individual and that level of development. So I think it's very much the whole kind of churches within thing. And then if you take that into other avenues, whether it's group work, esoteric work, whatever it happens to be. So yeah, it operates on both levels.
So, what do we gain by working together specifically?
Well, you've seen it probably in your own life, there's no question that there is a power to operating and interrelating on it. But of course, group prayer, look at the situation that we're dealing with now. How many people around the world are praying in relation to the situation over in Gaza? So,
And do we actually evolve faster? I would think that it would be exponential by working with each other.
I think that it can be done. What's interesting, I always go to the fourth way when you talk about this, because it's interesting the ways that were developed on Earth for spiritual advancement were, according to Gurdjieff, the way of the fakir, the way of the priest, and the way of the yogi. And but all those need to be developed in kind of isolated situations, but with schools. And the fourth way level of development had to take place in a person's ordinary life. So, if you work at a car wash or you're a novelist, whatever it happens to be, that's where you do the fourth way. So there's just different techniques for wherever you happen to find yourself. But every individual is a pattern. So it's never, what's great about the environment is it can open people up, right? We've seen that when people go into sacred architecture or something, their whole consciousness lifts up. But in fact, it's not required because, you have the entire pattern within. And it's quite interesting. There's a whole set of readings that Cayce gave relating to, all the mysteries relating to John and the Revelation. And it's quite fascinating because when he goes into it, you start to realize the incredible symbology of the whole thing and how it gets away from the literal translation of it at all. As a matter of fact, when he points to the 144,000, a lot of people have thought, there's going to be 144,000 people who'll be whisked away during the rapture. But he said, no, it's a cellular group that gets awakened inside of a person. So, your pineal gland becomes completely functional. The silver cord is active. Your third eye is awakened. And that's what it's a description of. So we get overly literal, I think, when it comes to mystical aspects.
What I think is great right now, whether you intended it or not, with everything that's going on, this feels like something I can hold on to.
Oh yeah.
That I can do, that I can apply in my daily life
Oh yeah.
to make a difference, because we can feel really hopeless and powerless in this situation and fearful, and we can retreat within ourselves. But this is practical,
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of noise out there. You have to remember that. And getting sucked into the vortex of overly identifying is very tricky. And you can imagine it happened, during Pearl Harbor and all these other periods of extreme war. And so we're getting a glimpse of it here in America. That war is over there, but they're trying to draw us in, just like, by 1939, the European wars were kicking off and they were trying to draw America into those wars. And we can feel, if you're sensitive to it, you can start to feel that right away. So it's very important not to over-identify with the things that you're seeing. And, I think there is a great disturbance, and you're seeing it even in alternative media, people getting very fractured and polarized. But in fact, the more important thing is not to over-identify with any aspect that's going on. It'll, you know, when you approach it in an objective fashion, you arrive at a totally different place with it. And that doesn't mean you shut off your emotions in relation to it, but you know, you're very careful about who is thinking for you.
Mm.
I think that that's maybe the way to
Yeah,
look
I
at
mean,
it.
who wants to be manipulated?
Right. Let me read a little bit of these predictions. And these come from the World Affairs readings, which I always say are a gold mine inside the Cayce work for understanding the structure of how the spiritual forces operate in the material world. The other series I would highly recommend in terms of self-development, excuse me, that come out of the Cayce work are the 262 readings, which are all about what meditation does. And yeah, I pointed out before that some of these people came to Cayce and were like, you know, I really want to develop this skill and I want to astral project and all this other stuff. And he would say, that's great. And they were like, what do I need to do? And he would say, okay, well, try, you know, kind of pushing an elderly person along the beach in their wheelchair on Virginia Beach, you know, and basically offering your time and service to somebody else. That will put you in the right mindset of service to be able to do all this. You know, this is very interesting because I think there's a lot of self-aggrandizing that goes on around acquiring different abilities, but a lot of it is service rooted, service oriented when you're coming out of the Cayce readings. And it's very interesting because if you don't, you know, there's two aspects to it according to Cayce. There's attunement and service. So if you're in that attunement, you know, like you mentioned the ayahuasca thing before, that's very interesting for attunement, right? Or very deep meditation. But if that's not fulfilled in some level of service, whatever it happens to be, I don't think there's any, you know, it has to be a particular choice of an individual. But then it becomes something that kind of is unresolved energy. It's not quite the same thing. So there's two aspects. So we start with the foundation of attunement and service. That comes directly out of that 262 series. So that's how I would look at that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is American Prophecy Mystery Schools, Back to the Future. Edgar Cayce, Sleeping Prophet, and Founding Father Thomas Jefferson. What do they have in common? Did Jefferson really incarnate? And did you know, did he incarnate and did Cayce meet him? He did, in fact. And what's interesting is he shows up directly related to Gladys Davis, and he's Gladys Davis's nephew. And Gladys Davis is, of course, Cayce's lifelong secretary and the one who builds the vault of the readings. So she's very crucial. And for, I would think for Jefferson to incarnate directly through there, it's probably going to be an episode of its own. But what I'm going to do is just give us that setup and this kind of idea that we're approaching around American patriotism and the influence of the mystery schools is going to be so crucial, I think, for us to focus on. So we'll go here for about another 15 minutes and we'll take your questions. How's that? Sound good?
Sounds good.
How are you doing out there?
Good. I need to remind everybody to ask your questions in all caps, please.
Why don't you throw them on my way and we will kick off with that. Go for it.
Okay. Alicia Holborn said, "Isn't the honest ideal to grow up and act like adults? It sounds too simple, yet rarely done." I love this because this is my approach is that really we could start there. That's basic. How about just what is the ideal adult, right? You know, responsible,
Oh, well,
kind,
yeah.
compassionate,
I
forgiving.
think we had
like
a
all these
better,
things.
no, we had a better idea of that even a decade ago.
Mhm.
They've thrown it out because they've wanted to, you know, roll out the crazy. There's no question about
Well, it
it.
has to do with, I mean, I hate to criticize capitalism, but something about advertising is all about exploitation of people's weaknesses. So they want to keep us weak like children.
Well,
right?
it reminds me of the story
Unconscious.
of Frank Capra
Mhm.
because Capra loved humanity. You can just watch his movies and see he's always rooting for the underdog. And he did some real classics as a director, like It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. That whole thing is all Capra. And there's a classic thing where he gets a Lifetime Award in the 70s. I think it's like 1979. And he gets, you know, he's talking with his friend and they're asking him how he's doing and does he watch a lot of television? And he says, "Oh, I can't stand television." And he says, why? He says, because the commercials make you hate humanity. So that's really, there's from somebody who really loves humanity. So they've made humanity something, it's kind of superficial thing, which is only concerned with what beer they're drinking. All right. Let's go to the core of this, because the Xerxes part, I think, is interesting in the Cayce readings and just left hanging there. So he's talking about predictions that are encased at Giza. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some of his prophecies and then bring us back to the lifetime in this incarnation of Thomas Jefferson as T.J. Davis. Yes, Thomas Jefferson Davis. And it was a Cayce reading that suggested to the parents they name him Thomas Jefferson. So that's pretty interesting. And so he's talking about how accurate the pyramid predictions are, because a group comes to him and says, can the pyramid actually predict events? And he says, oh, yes. In fact, the pyramid is a gigantic record, not only of the past, but of the future, the Great Pyramid. And then they say, well, how would it be accomplished? And he talks about, through the geometry, the mathematics, the setup, even the type of stone that's used in the curve, etc. And when they ask, well, how accurate are those? He says, they're so accurate that you can pinpoint an individual, including the name, the family name, and the street that they grew up on. So there's some kind of supercomputer out there that we call the Great Pyramid that's picking up on that. That's where this reading comes in. So he's saying that's how correct the hour, day, year, place, country, nation, and town individuals are pointed out, even their street name. Often there are changes that bring periods, as seen in the period when there's an alteration in that initiate in the land of Zu and Rata that brought a change, but at a different point because of being driven by those that were set as guides or guards of same. In the same pyramid did the great initiate, the master, speaking here of Jesus, take those last of the brotherhood degrees with John the Baptist, the forerunner of him at that place, as is indicated in that period where the entrance is shown to be in that land that was set apart as that promise to a peculiar peoples as were rejected. So he's referring there to the Hebrews and the 40 years in the desert, everything else. And he's describing how the pyramid shows it and how it comes into this period. So he says a few other things, and then he goes, this is shown in that portion where there is the turning back from the raising up of Xerxes as a deliverer from an unknown tongue or land. And again, as they're seen that this occurs in the entrance of the Messiah in this period, and he refers to the date, this big kickoff date is 1998. This is the period that we've been in since this new cycle has kicked in. We've been in it now 25 years. Xerxes is a Persian conqueror. Cayce mentioning him here is very strange, and he's mentioning him in the context of 1998. So there's some kind of reincarnation thing that he's pulling out here, but what he's saying is, you can see in the pyramid that it predicts this portion of time where there's a turning back from the raising up of Xerxes as the deliverer from an unknown tongue or land. What would be an unknown tongue or land in this period? I suppose aliens, I suppose artificial intelligence would be. But there you have Xerxes, and I can't help but notice the spelling on Xerxes has that X steganography embedded in it. And then he says that as a result of this, the Messiah enters in this period, 1998. So this is a consideration, again, Cayce going deep, some of these things that are left there as fragments for us to go and puzzle out. So they're asking him, what's going to happen? What's the large picture? Here we are approaching World War II, but give us, how do the world conditions settle? And he says, and remember, if he's looking out in 1939 at this, we have all that history, Kennedy assassination, World War II, Vietnam, the nuclear standoffs in the 80s, everything, all the period, the technological development, 9/11. He's looking out across that entire sphere of time. And he says, there will come then about these circumstances in the political, the economic, the whole relationships, where there will be a leveling or a greater comprehension of this spiritual need. Now, this is interesting because leveling comes up over and over again in the Cayce readings, that everything is going to build up to a gigantic leveling. And what he refers to there is spoken of over time, but it's basically that everyone who's in these kind of high and mighty positions tumbles down and they become just like every other person. So there's a gigantic overthrow of the ruling system. And he talks about it. They try to pinpoint him down a little bit. What are you speaking of? How is it going to work? And he often talks about the forces of capital versus the forces of labor. And this is the dynamic that he's describing. But this is the kind of corporate takeover over the average citizen. This is how we can interpret what he's giving us for the 21st century. But let's go deeper still. And I want to say here that what he refers to as new order is, they adopt the New World Order as their own kind of weird freak version of this. So we have this left hand New World Order, and then we have the right hand New Order. So remember to separate those because it'll get tricky. For as the time of the period draws
They
near,
love to co-opt everything.
What is it?
They love to co-opt everything.
Oh, they have to. Yeah, no question about
That's their MO.
And its names are very powerful. I think that we don't understand the impact of names enough when it comes to this.
Right,
but
spelling, as they always say.
For as the time or the period draws near for these changes that come with the new order, it behooves all of those who have an ideal, that's us, that's the ideas room, as individuals as well as groups or societies or organizations, to be practicing applying same in their experience, in their relationships one to another. So, it's a good reminder. We're often talking about big world events, the deep state and all this other stuff. But how do people relate and interrelate to each other just on the level of day-to-day life? And you get in little ways, you get the ability to make an impact all the time, literally, and it can make all the difference. What is that thing that they say? Sometimes people have entertained angels unawares, I'm not an angel last time I checked, but
you met someone you thought was an angel.
I did. Yes, I did.
I did too. I was working retail. I'll never forget it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they came up. Oh, God, it was weird. They came up to the front counter, and something about them, I just looked at them. I mean, they could have been an alien for all I know. But I mean, I didn't go there in my mind. I went to angel and went, there's something that's sparkly, otherworldly about this person. And it was almost this telepathic thing where I said, like, I just thought, are you what I think you are? And it sort of communicated back to me, yes, I am.
Interesting.
I'll never forget it. I'm like,
well,
there in my mind right now.
You don't, I have not heard you, except for this incident, I haven't heard you say that, on a regular basis. This is a rare thing. So that's fascinating that would happen to you and you would think that is what it was. I remember Timothy Good, who's this great UFO researcher, and he felt that on a number of occasions he had encountered people who were from, off-world societies visiting here. And it's interesting because he identified the very same quality about them. We're not talking about angels here. Now we're talking about visitors. But he described it very interestingly because, he implied this whole telepathic thing took place just like what you're talking about. And what's interesting is that Ingo Swann, he said that the first thing that he noticed when he encountered one was their incredible telepathy. And he was like, I'm not, I'm not outing you as an alien, I swear. So there is a heavy telepathic thing. But the angels part, we've seen a lot of people who encounter these individuals. And I've spoken before about Cayce himself. When he was at very low periods in his life, this individual would show up who was wearing a turban. And for most of those times when he showed up, he would give Cayce some kind of cryptic message that Cayce would eventually realize was very powerful advice, and other people couldn't see him. But then things changed, and there was one major event where in New York City, everybody saw him. So, I think when you get on that level, there are individuals who pop in and pop out. And I don't think that we know where they're coming from. But certainly the angel thing, absolutely.
I decided to ask everybody in the chat if they had experiences like this, and they have.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me because the ideas from us is an enlightened bunch.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's try to get a little more of these in. So we have this strange thing about Xerxes. We have now predictions going out into the 21st century that there's going to be a huge leveling. If you go through those world affairs readings, you're going to find leveling is referred to over and over again. I believe this is the stage that we're in now, which is why he referred to it. And then now we talk about Cayce talking about Russia being the hope of the world. This is very interesting because at the time, Russia was friendly enough with America, but they were hardly a beacon. They had the Bolshevik Revolution and there weren't a lot of freedoms there. So people looked at Cayce and said, basically, what are you talking about? And we did join forces, of course, with them to defeat the Nazis. So there was a gigantic merging of that. No one would have predicted that at the time. But what he's talking about here is 1939. He said, out of Russia, you see, there may come that which may be the basis of a worldwide religious thought or trend. Then that which may be added or that may be added to the present time may be presented. Let's work with that, what we've got, and go step by step. So they're trying to ask him questions like, who is it in Russia that's going to do this? When is this going to happen? And he's like, it's going to happen, but this is what's going on. The hope of the world phrase that Cayce uses, he will use consistently from the 1920s through the 1930s into the 40s. So there's something about this hope of the world through Russia aspect. Is there a group that's in development there that will, throw out the government that's there? They just live side by side until that whole stage of government is over. We don't know what it is, but there's something there that's operational inside of Russia that leads to being the hope of the world. Let's go a little further. Again, back to this leveling. There cannot be one measuring stick for the laborer in the field and the man behind the counter, the kind of corporate oligarch, and another for the man behind the money changers, the central bankers. All are equal, not only under the material law, but under the spiritual law. And his laws will not come to naught. Though there may be those periods when there will be great stress as brother rises against brother, as group, sect, or race rises against race, yet the leveling must come. The leveling, again. I guess I could have put the leveling in parentheses for the title of this episode. And only those who have set their ideal in him and practiced it in their dealing, of course, this is Cayce being the Christian minister that he is, will survive. And then he says, hence, those will be leveled. Leveling. This is the period I think we need to look to, which is there's been too much power concentrated at the top. It's made the structure top heavy. The top is starting to collapse. What just came out about Anthony Fauci? Were you paying attention? It's very interesting. In the middle of this whole wave of terrorism, very damning emails came out about Anthony Fauci and his knowledge of the whole COVID op, et cetera, that Rand Paul brought forward. And he feels confident now that they'll have the ability to put Fauci on trial over his activities in relation to the Wuhan lab. That's gigantic. It's a huge breakthrough that people have been working for since 2020? And it got drowned out in all of this, but it's major and it relates to lives on the ground as well. So, this whole process, I think, of leveling is important for us to keep in mind. And then a little bit more here. In relation to world conditions, any who seek such information, such as we've indicated, things we're talking about here, had best be in a position to do something about same. For that given becomes then not only a duty, but an obligation upon the part of those to whom such may be given in the nature of the relationships that exist. As has been given, that which has prevented and does prevent the whole of civilization becoming a turmoil is the attempt of those who have the ideals of the Prince of Peace at heart. So here's Cayce saying, it's a small group. And later what will happen is he says, 50, if the 50 people in this room pray for peace, then the United States will not be invaded. That's the power that Cayce is ascribing to individuals. So then we start to see what that's all about. And it's basically that we break out of these kind of energy bubbles and we break through all of that and we don't become part of the energetic, suction of this kind of war drums, and I think this is important for us to keep in mind because, and I think in a way, most people are aware of it. They'll say, well, they're aware of the power of positive thinking or prayer or whatever. But these situations, humanity has faced things, down like World War II and the nuclear face-off. And then we go into a period of stress like the one that we're talking about. It is exceptional because of the type of technology that's involved, because of the type of revelations, because of the type of period. But in fact, in certain ways, through the culture, through the mystery schools, through some of these other pieces, we are given the tools to kind of, face off against this thing. And if you go, and Cayce shares this with anthroposophy, if you go into the Steiner readings, he says, in fact, it has to be faced off in order. It's like a graduation step for humanity. There's no way around it. But at the same time, you want it to come out for the best. And the stakes that are involved, according to Steiner, involve the entire spiritual evolution of humanity. Keep that in mind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is American Prophecy, Mystery Schools, Back to the Future. Cayce, Thomas Jefferson, the Rosicrucians, these pieces that connect up, and we're going to thread them more together as we get into tonight and your questions, and also for Mystery October, which is all about the mystery schools this month, which some very exciting things coming up for you. I want to remind you before we go any further to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter, which keeps us in touch. And it really kind of gets us around this incredible wall that we've seen. And, I think about it when it comes to censorship, I've been doing this for a fairly long time. And the way that I look at it is it comes down to, my best kind of network for this are the people in the ideas room. It has to do with you and, sharing the information that we bring forward. And so many of you, I think, do that and make sure we do get around. And, some of the fantastic things that happen once in a while, it's great, whether we're on somebody's show and we get a big response from it, something like that. But what I've found is, regardless of all the incredible suppression of that kind of censorship, it doesn't interfere with the way that I think about what I'm doing. I'm just going to, continue to get through it. And I've often pointed out to Olivia, if I have to do it and broadcast on an iPhone, I'll do it. And then they'll shut off the iPhone. But I do feel, and I want to say this in all seriousness, that it is the kind of conversations that we have here on this show and in the ideas room are exactly the kind of things that they're trying to shut down. And when you saw the COVID op, it really exposed the type of communication that they like to shut off. And that was the whole 6 feet, apart, don't talk to each other, except over electronic digital means that we can track, because they don't want anything outside of the system. That's real. And it's important to realize there are people who benefit and and we are kind of the data track for them, and that's what they data mine. So we are, they're trying to make us into their product. And so the more we go around that conversation and just talk directly to each other, we generate a whole different field of information and knowledge. And especially, when I get around characters like Cayce and Steiner, who, these are people I've marveled at my entire life. And you can't, it doesn't matter how many books you read about them, you can never get to the bottom of that. It's just the inspiration that they bring forward for you. And when it comes to mystery school teachers in general, like Gurdjieff and others, it seems to me, it does feel to me very often, and this is true with Steiner, that you're dealing with multiple people all at once, and not multiple personalities, but it's just amazing to me that they reach such a level where they actually are acting out a number of lives at one time. So this is what I've seen with it. But the information is there and it's powerful and it's always coming up in new places or rediscovery, which is another thing I think that comes into mystery teachings. There's a lot laid out there, whether you're into Manly P. Hall or you're looking at the Gurdjieff work or Cayce's work or the Rosicrucians, whatever it happens to be. There's some sense that there's a hidden reality that's right there behind the everyday reality that we interact with. And it can be the difference between a productive life, a happy life, and something totally different. Or it can sometimes be the difference between, life and death. I mean, it's that sense of intuition. It's that sense of connection. So that's important for us to keep in mind. We're going to take your questions in a moment here. I've got one more set of quotes I want to read, and then the rest of the stuff I'll just roll into the Q&A. How are you doing out there?
Great. Scarlet Fire says darkness, evil, is defined as the absence of light. There is a spark, spirit, within you. Make it your light, and you will always find the way.
Wow, that's really great. Yeah.
It's interesting. I was thinking, I think when people first start reading spiritual books, things, Cayce, whatnot, Steiner, you admire these people, but you don't think you could be like them or should be like them or emulate them in any way, right?
Yeah, that's really true.
But in this day and age, rather than that seeming like arrogance, I think we actually have to level up. We have to ask of ourselves. I hate to this saying has been so overused, but be the change that we want to see, and that means become the leaders. Because spiritually, we have to get to their level as quickly as possible, wherever we are in our lives. So instead of admiring them from afar, we have to become them.
Yes, our own best versions of them. Or else people will start shaving their heads like Gurdjieff or dressing like Annie Besant. Yeah, that's really interesting too. It's finding that it's Joseph Campbell's. It's finding the hero in yourself, like that, which I think is very important.
Actually, I was just watching a Joseph Campbell video tonight before going live,
Okay.
and it was so refreshing. It wasn't dated at all. The whole following your bliss thing, but it was about really stepping into life and living life with passion and zest. Is the whole point of life.
Oh, that's really true.
I think for the last 3.5, I know I'm talking a lot this episode. For the last 3.5 years, they have gotten us our lives have become smaller, more repressed, more suppressed, more depressed, and everything. And I think, at a certain point, you have to step outside of your fear and say, this is my life. And this is our world, and we need to, again, be the change.
Absolutely.
I'm tired of playing small.
No, I agree. And the other thing I would point out about that is one of the reasons that somebody like Campbell stays fresh is what happens is when you are at that level of enlightenment, what you say is different. It's timeless. And it doesn't matter what period you're talking in. And I think that people have found this with other people like Krishnamurti and others. And it's very interesting because Campbell has that ability. When you listen to him, you can hear the awareness, and it's something I think responds in people. And he was already in his 80s when he was giving those interviews. He'd hung around as an author and a teacher at a very obscure, Sarah Lawrence. I mean, that's a great college, but nobody, his general place on the radar was very low before he did those PBS interviews, and then the stuff skyrockets and he checks out. Right? It's fascinating how that works sometimes. More about Cayce and this leveling, and then I'm going to read something else from the Thomas Jefferson lifetime, and then we're going to go to your questions.
Okay.
Let's do it this way. Then if those in position to give of their means, their wealth, their education, their position, do not take these things into consideration, there must be the leveling that will come. For unless these are considered, there must eventually become a revolution in America. And there will be a dividing of the sections as one against another, for these are the leveling means and manners to which men resort when there is plenty in some areas and a lack of sustenance in the life of others. These are the manners in which such things as crime, riots, and every nature of disturbance arise, and that those who are in authority are not considering every level, every phase of human activity and human experience. Now, here is Cayce. A lot of people sometimes think of Cayce as he has these spiritual readings and this heavy language. Here he's speaking right directly, cutting through it all and saying, basically, this is the nature of the root of the problem. And you have a very small group hoarding wealth, hoarding technology, hoarding advanced knowledge, and they are lording it over the society. And at this point, as we know, with that kind of centralization of power, they're trying to move into centralizing the currency. They're trying to move into removing genders. They're trying to take your kids away from you through state controls and turn them over to the state. This is that kind of AI vision that they have and the transhumanist version of the world that they're trying to develop. And a great deal of this, of course, plugs into the research that we do here on this program related to space. So let's keep that in mind, that this is the thing that Cayce's looking at and saying there's got to be a leveling in relation to this. And as we look at it, we see everywhere this kind of transhumanist takeover taking place. And you say, where would it break? Where will be the break in the action? But there it is, sitting in the World Affairs readings from 1939, Cayce looking out and saying, there's this leveling will happen. Keep that in mind as we go forward. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're going to start to take your questions, and then I'll read the Thomas Jefferson quote.
Rick says, maybe we awaken to realize this is a simulation, and we may then exit the cycle of birth and death. And Kontiki Man says, if Cayce prophecies are correct, what happens to free will? Certainly with regard to reincarnation, assuming we're not living in a predetermined universe.
Well, look at it this way. First of all, Cayce is all about free will. And he was never big on prophecies. People asked him to predict things over and over again. And he would say, well, here's the trend for that. This condition will arise. Earth changes are going to happen in the 21st century. And because he said those things, a lot of people would say, aha, prophet of doom. So you'd get a lot of TV shows and a lot of websites and things just saying, Cayce predicts pole shift. And it's true on some level, but then also Cayce would say, well, this is a gradual experience for humanity. So it's not cataclysmic the way it was, say, when Atlantis went under, but nonetheless, it's taking place. So we're looking, we're getting kind of an idea there, I would say. So you never want to lock yourself into any prophecy. It's all about the free will. And supposedly, even God doesn't know what we're going to do. And so therefore, we have that ability to create our version of reality. There's no question about that. We've seen it over and over again. They've done tests on it with sports teams since the 1950s, where they would tell one team to kind of use this positive reinforcement thing. So there's no question that we create our reality, or at least we create the tendency toward that more positive outcome. Just like the Cayce fundamental tenet, I would say, is mind is the builder. Why is mind the builder? Think about anything that you've done in your life, really. You set it out and mentally envisioned it, and it created it and made it come to pass. So your mind is kind of the pass-through. It's the creation zone of the whole thing. And then you bring that into materiality, you bring it into physicality. And that's why what you think and what you project mentally is very important. It's funny, Cayce would say things like thoughts are things. So you can see how important it is to keep your thoughts positive. And they would ask him, well, how real is that, is the thought? And he would say, as real as a pin in the hand. It's pretty real. So when we look at it that way, Cayce's giving us this hint. He's not saying you have to think positive thoughts all the time. But he's saying your mind is building your reality. What kind of reality do you want to live in? And your mind, of course, is creating it. So I think that this is important for us to keep in mind when you are surrounded. They used to say, oh, you're surrounded by TV and newspapers, and they're giving you all this negative stuff about the economy or whatever it happens to be. Well, now it's in a phone in your pocket. And, it's everywhere, right? So it's even more invasive. The next step, of course, is they implant it right into you, right? Elon Musk is working on that. Well, how much of a freedom fighter is Elon Musk to be working on Neuralink, which is basically, a control chip in your brain? I mean, that's the ultimate AI. So for me, what's happening is the curve is, until it's stopped by a kind of ethical barrier, the curve is closer and closer and closer directly into you physically, and then your energy field. And so I had the great privilege years ago of interviewing Catherine Albrecht, who was way ahead of everybody on all this stuff about implants and what they were going to try to do with a chip and all the rest of it.
Right, Spy Chips, wasn't that her book?
Spy Chips is the book, and
Mhm.
the book is from 2007. But she went to Harvard here, so she she was in that whole Ivy League thing, but she broke out of it completely. And the remarkable thing that she put across, literally, was that the meetings that these people held, it seems like their own ethical barriers were going further and further down. But the meetings that the people on the corporate structure level were holding were all about, how can we get this by without the public catching on and stopping us? And then when you go into the work of other people who've been in the government, they'll sit down and have those meetings. How can we do this without the public freaking out about it? So the whole thing is about creating these stories, and we've seen them. They did it recently with COVID. They've been building up the UFO threat aspect in relation to this. It's, a little blend in there on the unconscious level. It's the CIA UFO op. It's a threat, and at a certain point, it's a full blown piece. So I think what's happening is, the more aware that we are as this comes in, and you can call it harmonic, directly from the Steiner work, and looking at the Cayce readings, what he's projecting out is that these groups are doing it, and they're doing it to hold on to power. And what Cayce and Steiner and that ilk of mystery knowledge is saying is that the march is towards freedom. So therefore, they're on the wrong side, but nonetheless, they are formidable. And so there's the cross for you. But let's not forget that basically the thing we're rooting for is the leveling. And that's what he says is coming. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. American Prophecy, Edgar Cayce, The Mystery Schools, Back to the Future, Thomas Jefferson. We're taking your questions. We'll take your questions for about another 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll call this special report out. I want to remind you, while I have your attention, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. The newsletter has all the information that you're going to need about exciting X-series shows we have coming up for you. Documentaries, watch out for the things that we have coming up the end of October to November and December for the rest of this year. Totally mind-blowing, incredible guests and events. Everything is there in that free newsletter. So take that 30 seconds, sign up for the newsletter so you're in the know, stand up and be counted. And of course, while you're on the site, get behind the show, subscribe. We've made it very affordable for people to come on board. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay. The Black Zionist says, I want to know what mystery school Albert Pike was a part of to predict the 3 world wars. World War III is the Muslims and the Jews destroying each other to usher in the Antichrist. This is going around, so you've got to address it.
No, I'm glad you asked it, actually. No, the Pike quote is completely bogus. So, first of all, Pike, is operating in 1860s and 1870s. There's no Nazis, and there's no World War I and World War II, so he can't talk about World War III yet. So, there's always some hinky lineage with this stuff. Oh, somebody found it in a book in 1984. Sorry, it's not. But what's interesting is Albert Pike is absolutely important, and it's quite fascinating because there's a whole aspect about secrecy in the government that they've been able to use to move projects through different government agencies that relied directly on a method that he exposed back in the 1870s. And I think that there's an incredible crisscross of his knowledge base and the incredible things he brought forward. Unfortunately, the quote, just like sometimes you'll see quotes, and it's an important subject, but somebody has invented the quote. And so in the case of the Albert Pike quote, that was invented. But nonetheless, what the person is trying to put across there in how these wars are arranged, obviously, whoever was, forging the quote knew a great deal about the structure. They just got the times wrong. Yes.
Right. And if we haven't taken the time to study Pike, now is the time. Is he the Great? Who is the hidden hand provoking World War III? And is it possible they aren't human?
Well, depending on what level that you're talking about, they absolutely don't have to be human. So when you're speaking of a level of astral malevolence, who thrive on war and thrive on humans, there's no doubt that in these systems, like spiritual science, they talk about beings that are like that. I think that we understand, even through basic traditions and people's experience and that wonderful human experience that's passed down to us, that didn't require a computer until very recently. We have that, where we have it built in to us, that understanding. But those groups and those beings do operate, and I believe that all the information that we've brought forward about the eighth sphere, and Gigi Young has done a lot of shows on that. She's done them with us. We're going to do another show on that coming up with Gigi. But the eighth sphere is quite important in relation to that, because I think this is important. So what I look at when I see Steiner, and I know I have a shot of him somewhere, but basically Steiner, I can tell you, basically, if you boil it down, he spent 4 decades trying to warn us about Ahriman and the eighth sphere. So he did his best to enter into that spiritual state, to read the Akashic record and bring forward that information. And if you really boil it down, yes, there's all kinds of different things that he gets into, but so much of it relates to the 21st century. 1, 2, it relates to the Ahrimanic ability and this dark astral force, and how it's mixed up with humanity, which we've tackled on a number of shows. But this is the era of Ahriman. So this period that we're in is the face-off. And what happens there is very interesting, because either, we face this and evolve as a result on a natural track, or this thing that Steiner refers to as the eighth sphere develops, and that's kind of a virtual reality realm. And we've already seen this when people living in imagination. And a lot of people live in imagination just with daydreams and things. But now the ability to convert that into a technological zone, like the metaverse and that whole thing, where you just operate in this thing plugged in to that, and you're projecting your own human force and human consciousness into this technological construct. That is the eighth sphere. And so Steiner's warning us, oh, this is how they're going to do it. They've been developing this. And by the way, when it comes to reincarnation, we go through these various stages in between our lives on Earth. Supposedly, we have incarnations on other planets as different types of entities. It's kind of a school, the school of Mars, the school of Saturn. And it's very interesting, because what Steiner is saying is that, well, what happens is you go into the eighth sphere and you miss the natural spiritual evolutionary tip. You get into a false reincarnation cycle. And that's very, very disturbing, because what he's suggesting is the entire spiritual evolutionary path of humanity gets thrown off from what it's meant to develop, which in spiritual science is New Jupiter, right? Well, there's a cosmology for you. But nonetheless, New Jerusalem, New Jupiter, these are things that are esoterically let out. And we can, we go so far with them, they spark something off in our imagination and our consciousness. And what he's saying is, no. If Ahriman gets the upper hand in the 21st century, if people are, removing their genders, if they are, being rubbed out as human beings and they are just signing up for this machine or augmented machine, they have chips in their brains and they're becoming part of this artificial intelligence project, then that's the eighth sphere, and their being is being controlled and consumed by this thing. So that's the real threat about it. And for me, that's where the mystical work of Steiner brings us. That's the period that we're in. And I would say that my own analysis of what Steiner brought forward is that's the most innovative aspect around the mystery schools for giving us a warning about the period that we're in. Absolutely. Just like I think that Cayce's work around Atlantis and how we're repeating the cycle is something that nobody else mastered on the level that he did in those 900 life readings. Yes.
Sovereign Brian, I think it's obvious that something non-human is setting us up to war with each other, and we've been told as much since the beginning. And the Philip K. Dick Film Festival says Ahriman is a mental parasite that exists in us and also in cultures. The natives call it Wetiko. The parasite cannot live in unconditional love. So this reminds me of that episode of Star Trek, Day of the Dove. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, that is, again, look, whoever was writing Star Trek, just like the people who wrote Twin Peaks and these other shows, were plugged in to Cayce and Steiner, and they used these things over and over again. But Day of the Dove is this energy source that feeds on them fighting the Klingons and the...
Well, it's an entity.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And, well, it's an energy force, and all we see is this kind of ball of energy. And it gets, when they get at their most feverish and their most violent battle, then that thing lights up like a Christmas tree. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point, they've exhausted their weapons, and it gives them new weapons, and it gives them swords to fight with and all this. So I think this is a very pertinent message being slid directly through this kind of space science fiction piece. And you can feel it. And I'll tell you, when you get into Gene Roddenberry, you realize through his work of channeling the nine and these other things that he was very, very deep on the esoteric tip. Yes.
Also they, I didn't think about it when I watched it originally, but when the crew members die, they are resurrected to fight again.
Yes.
It is reincarnation, actually.
Yeah.
Because they want the war to continue on and on and on, so it can feed off the loosh.
Well, this is interesting. Segue into a Cayce reading. Nicely done. Is America fulfilling her destiny? 1940. Rather should the question be sought, my children, are individuals fulfilling those channels to which they have been brought through their own application of the knowledge within themselves to fulfill their position? For each and every one, each and every nation is led, even as in heaven. For what you see on earth is a pattern of that in the mind, as you well know, and is a shadow of spiritual truth. This is, as has been given, if there's not the acceptance in America of the closer brotherhood of man, the love of neighbor as self, civilization must wend its way westward. And again must Mongolia, must a hated people be raised. Is America filling its destiny? Is it filling rather its place, that destined in the experience of peoples or a nation? What have you done with the knowledge that you have spiritually? So Cayce's putting it back on the person. And often we, look out at the grand scheme of things and we say, oh, we've got the deep state doing this. We have this politician failing. We have Hillary Clinton lying in this interview. We have Joe Biden stumbling down the stairs, whatever it happens to be. So we're surrounded by that. We can't help but see the emperor has no clothes. But here's Cayce saying, yes, you have that. That's your challenge. But what are you doing? Like, how are you fulfilling your role? And how is that going? Now, there is something where the society is infringing upon the ability. For example, when there are all these requirements, if you wanted to go back to work as a teacher or work in a hospital, when the COVID op was going on, there's interference in this. And this is where I think, when Cayce talks about the leveling, if you reach too far into people's lives, the balance is so far off that, the inclination of the entire being is to throw off the disease. And that's what we're witnessing. So this is the kind of the nature of the period we're in. Yes, Miss
Yeah,
Olivia.
I actually, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Right after 9/11, Thomas Friedman did a special called The Roots of 9/11 or The Roots to 9/11.
Oh, yeah.
And it was about how people, men in particular, need to live with dignity and opportunity. And if they don't, they will lash out violently. And I think it's easy to see this in an individual circumstance, like what is happening with the Palestinians in Israel. But also,
yeah.
just generally throughout history, like I just finished watching Deadwood, right? And it's just true is that, people, it's all a hierarchy of men. And the lower, what you see time and time again is basically the lower, the men on the lower rungs, how they have to kind of lash out and either they betray the ones above them or they have to lash out at people under them because they're not living, they're frustrated with their lot in life.
Absolutely true.
And this is
Yeah.
something we need to understand is that this is more than anything, it's an economic system issue is that people, men in particular, need dignity and opportunity.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. And when you give the ability for a person to create that themselves, then they can do all the work for it. When you take that away, it's like you're creating the Frankenstein. All right, Cayce readings again. That incredible vision out to the future. Here we go. 1941. As to the conditions in the geography of the world or the country, changes here are gradually coming about. These are the earth changes. No wonder then that the entity feels the need, the necessity for change of central location. For many portions of the East Coast will be disturbed, as well as many portions of the West Coast, as well as the central portion of the U.S. Later, he clarifies this and says, this will be another generation, though, but you're feeling it. You're starting to sense it already. Lands will appear in the Atlantic as well as in the Pacific, and what is the coastline now of many a land will be the bed of ocean. Even many of the battlefields of the present will be oceans, will be seas, the bays, the lands over which the new order will carry on their trade with one another. Think about this. Now, land will appear in the Atlantic. Land rising. I've tried to point this out as a key aspect in Cayce's work, and you see it show up in the other mystery school teachings, that the idea that with this shift that's taking place, land is rising, and particularly in that hot zone area with Bimini and the Bahamas, and that land is the subject of an entirely covert battle that's taking place in relation to what's rising up, who's going to get it, etc. And then, every once in a while you hear these things blown off. And you're always talking about, like the water levels are rising and, this kind of thing with global warming. You never hear anything about land that's rising. This is a crucial aspect to put on the radar. And so that's something that Cayce did there. And I'm pulling forward as well on that and pointing it out. But what he's saying here is many of the battlefields of the present, okay, what are they? Japan, Germany, Italy, France. And what is the coastline now of many a land will be the bed of ocean. That is serious earth changes coming up for the 21st century that we're in. And here's the thing, Cayce's looking out at it. And again, he's saying we have free will and that influences. And this is a gradual, not a cataclysmic event. But it is important that those people who are operating on the top of the societal chain, at the top of the pyramid, as it were, they are very aware of the mystery school arc and the mystery school teachings. And they could be positioning the entire world so that when those changes are settled, they're still ending up at the top of the pyramid and they don't have to suffer this leveling. And that may be a major aspect of them moving a number of assets into space and creating this gigantic space infrastructure that's been going on for 50 years. We have not got back to the moon. It's absolutely ridiculous. We've funded the whole thing. And now they're up there playing God, monitoring everything on the surface. So this is the nature, there's nothing black magic about that. I'm sure they study black magic, but what I'm saying is, when we're looking at it, it can be dissected in terms of what exactly is taking place. And so I think the space aspect is very important when you combine it with this. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I'm sorry, I'm bonding over Star Trek here.
I'll give you the Cayce dream about Nebraska on the West Coast. All right, so he has this terrible thing that happens where his former promoter, this Morton Blumenthal, is a stockbroker who's really become rich off the Cayce readings, but he's a brilliant guy, and he's a very deep person. But because, again, of this battle of wills that takes place, Blumenthal says, you can only give readings for us. You can't give readings for other people. And Cayce says, no way. I don't care how much money you have. And so they pull all the funding for Cayce's hospital, and he becomes broke again, basically. So what they do is they kind of track him a little bit, and they set him up with this situation where he gives a reading, and then they have a crooked judge in there who says, oh, let's put him in jail for practicing medicine without a license. So it's a real low moment in his life when he's thinking, I'll just get out of this. And so he has a dream in which he's born again over 200 years in the future and travels to various sections of the country where the records of Edgar Cayce were found. So he says, I'd been born again in 2158 AD. In Nebraska, the sea apparently covered all of the western part of the country, as the city where I lived was on the coast. The family name was a strange one. At the early age as a child, I declared myself to be Edgar Cayce, who had lived 200 years before. Scientists, men with long beards, little hair, and thick glasses, were called in to observe me. They decided to visit the places I said I had been born, lived, and worked in Kentucky, Alabama, New York, Michigan, and Virginia, taking me with them. The group of scientists visiting these places in long, cigar-shaped metal flying ships, which moved at incredibly high speeds. That's 1934. There's no UFO waves, nothing. Think of all the UFO sightings with cigar-shaped ships. And then we have, he looks out and all the buildings are made of glass and water covers different states and all the rest of it. And when he gets to New York, it's like recovering from having been in a huge earthquake or a huge war zone. So this is what his trip to the future was all about. Gives us some inclination about what's happening there. So the earth changes impact us greatly over the course of 100 years. And we're starting to see the strains of that now. And the more that that's embedded into the culture as like a living wisdom tradition that we're aware of, that we're moving into, then I think, because it's funny, if you look back, you can find books, if you go back to the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, that were dealing with the subject matter. For some reason, it goes off, it becomes very commercialized into things like Gaia TV or whatever. And so I think it loses credibility and it's dialed back. But there's an awareness there in the culture that's handed down. And you can see that the culture was picking up on it before they were overwhelmed with this noise. We'll take two more questions, Miss Olivia. You're up.
Okay, I lost what I was going to ask. Sovereign Brion again. Question: what's happening is part of the school or something that has blown us off course? And Christine Laurel says, is DJ saying that America's current crises, Anana's descent to the underworld, America has to go through this period to actually advance? Is this planned, or did we fall into some sort of an accident?
Yeah, I mean, there's an organization, it's by design that they're going to try to pull America down, and they're going to try to divide it, because when they divide it, they can come in and gather the spoils, as it were. That's why it's very important. You see a lot of flag waving independent media stuff that talks about, oh, it's civil war with this and civil war that. Well, whether they realize it or not, they're being a witting tool for exactly what that larger structure is looking to do. They want a civil war to take place between people who have a sensible idea about how the government should operate in a person's life, how the nation should operate, and who are constitutionalists by nature. And of course, the FBI now has made that group, puts them on their terror list, right? So, you have a lot of different aspects of the empire working against us. There's no question about it. But are there accidents involved? There's no question, for sure. And I would say that, although it's a crucial period, it's not that there shouldn't be any room for a pessimistic outlook about it. It's just extremely challenging. It's kind of a call for aware people everywhere to maybe work a little bit more tightly together, to be a little more aware, a little more sound about their decisions, a little less into the machine. And there's obviously big changes that are coming. Yes.
Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, have Cayce's readings been used by any modern presidents?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, we know that Cayce gave readings during his lifetime for Woodrow Wilson and laid out the famous 14 points that, this whole thing about the League of Nations and things of that nature. Later on, the UN comes into being, and then they distort what the UN is supposed to be, which the idea that, all these nations build up and then they have wars with each other because they're not operating on a central ideal. And so the original idea, League of Nations, UN, these types of things, is to build a family of nations and things along this line. But instead, it got converted, and there's a period, that you can read about of the Rockefellers basically hijacking that entire thing and just using it to take over, farmland and other assets. But Cayce in 1920 is whisked off to the White House to give readings for a very ailing Woodrow Wilson. And he lays out many of these very, very deep points. What's interesting also is that before Cayce died, the person who had booked a number of readings with him was Henry Wallace, who was the VP at the time. And Henry Wallace, as we know, I've called him President X because he was going to be president. He was actually FDR's VP from 1940 through 1944. And then when the election happens, he's supposed to be VP and all the rest of it. And through a number of strange things that they do, they put Truman into that position. And, but I think it is interesting that this guy Wallace is so aware on that mystery school train coming out of the West Coast halcyon version of theosophy that Henry Wallace is calling Cayce looking for readings about world affairs. And so there's Cayce getting called off to the White House again. We've seen with Jean Dixon from Roosevelt through Nixon and Reagan, she had worked and done all kinds of psychic readings. She had something like 79 visits to the Nixon White House. And the person who found that out was somebody who was looking for, after 9/11, was a journalist who said, there must have been some kind of terrorism task force that existed before the thing we have now with Bush. And when he went back into those records, he found that the person who was giving them advice in the 70s to combat terrorism was Jean Dixon with her psychic premonitions. So that psychic aspect is active. Sometimes we get to see it. We're lucky. Remember, it came out that Reagan was using an astrologer and it was a big scandal. These people, of course, use these things, and they should. They should. The only thing that they shouldn't do is lie about it, right? All right, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special. We're going to wind it down. We'll take one more question. The American Prophecy, American Mystery Schools, Back to the Future, Thomas Jefferson. I've got a quote of Jefferson about the Cayce Jefferson piece, and then we're done. Do you want to give me that last question?
Why don't you read first?
Okay. Well, basically, I want to sum up because I'm going to do an episode on the lives of Jefferson. And this is basically through the channel of Edgar Cayce. And we have to remember the remarkable things, of course, that we owe Jefferson by drafting the Declaration of Independence and having such a heavy hand in the Constitution. And that great possibilities that were there, because what Cayce saw in the development of our friend Thomas Jefferson was that not only had he been Alexander the Great with this incredible track record. But he said, Alexander the Great got basically too full of himself, obviously, and at the end of his life kind of betrayed who he was and just engorged his ego. But he went further back and he said, in the Atlantean times, um, Jefferson was a ruler, and he was right between the Sons of Belial group and the Amelius group. The Amelius group being the kind of higher spiritual group, and the Belial group using the Atlantean technology to kind of exterminate anyone they didn't like. And what he has him doing is giving the impression to the Belial group that he's a spy. And so they start to turn on him. And he's basically become a spy for the Amelius group. And the Amelius group is like, well, this guy's also been very associated with the Belial group. So he's right there in this kind of spy intrigue back in Atlantis. And what does he do? During the incredible upheavals that are going on, Jefferson takes his group directly to Ohio to become the Ohio Mound Builders. And we see that incredible serpent mound of this very advanced symbol. And nobody's, they were like, wow, the mound builders were advanced, but this thing is off the charts. That's the Jefferson group from Atlantis going into America. And of course, when he reincarnates in America, he becomes, again, somebody in a position of kind of colonizing and really making the ideal of America. So when he comes back during the Cayce period, his parents are alcoholic, and this proves too much of an obstacle for him. And his dad has a real gambling problem. So his upbringing is very disturbed. And instead of fulfilling this incredible role, he was born in 1936. So let's say by about 35, he would have been on the world scene. So we would have been looking at this guy in the 70s and 80s, really making major changes in our world. Instead, he got off on this whole personal trip. And it's remarkable because when you do read his letters, you can feel the Jeffersonian overtones coming in. And this guy had Cayce as kind of a surrogate father, and Gladys Davis as, a surrogate mom, in a sense, being his aunt, and it's her brother who had him. So, he had tremendous opportunities, and his realizations, I think, are fascinating. So we're going to get into that in the episode that we do on Thomas Jefferson's past life through the lens of Edgar Cayce. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're done for tonight.
Oh, wait, wasn't I supposed to ask one more question?
Okay, yes.
Okay, all right. Just to sum up, Sun Hero says the deep state has no true power. They've convinced us they do. The real power lies in all of us if we tune into it. And the Buddhist of Boston Sports says it's the same thing Christ was saying. You are Christ and have the same abilities inside you. You just don't know. And the truth is kept from you.
Wow, that's really true. Yeah.
So we have to step into our power. And our power is about the power of love.
I said, I get the impression that it's funny too, because a lot of people are really tuning in and becoming aware of things, so that the most extraordinary people who you would never think in a million years would make, this incredible jump from the positions that they held, say, 5 years ago versus the positions that they hold now. So there is an awareness level rising. I think a lot of my thought in relation to this is it rising fast enough to stem this tide? And I think that the crux, the overflow point, is the 2024 election, which is why I think it's so crucial, and why people who I think have become cynical about that political process need to throw that out and really be involved for 2024, because it's not a good time for cynicism, because I don't think that America can survive, the committee that's running Stepford Biden into another term, or if they replace him with gruesome Newsom from California, none of those things. I think that the Trump forces and Bobby Kennedy's run both represent constitutional government. They're both aware that they need to close the border from the incredible invasion that's taking place there, which will eventually, if it's allowed to just run like a fire hose, destroy the country just by the overflow of people and create all kinds of tense situations. And it's funny because, I say that with a clear knowledge that we have a good, the idea of an immigration policy and bringing people in to work and establish themselves here has been manipulated so poorly from what it's meant to be. And so it's meant to be an incredible addition for the society. But unless that situation can be stopped and reversed, and I think Trump certainly in his term was brave enough to stand up for that. And you hear people, understanding just how crucial this is. This is what I think the most important issue that's going on right now is the flooding of America with these people. And what are they doing by doing this? This is a totally different policy than we've ever had. Certainly, they've had holes in the system before, but this is the encouragement. And we have the UN funding and supporting the people as they come up from these different countries. But the countries that they're coming in from are hostile very often to the United States, whether it's Venezuela, Iran, or the Middle East, whatever it happens to be. So, I think we should be friends with everyone around the world. There's a way to do it. But this infiltration that's going on is run by the deep state because they're the ones who are controlling the border. They're opening it up. So that is the USA versus the deep state. It's the situation that we're in. And so it's crucial, no doubt about it. And I think with that, that becomes the core for 2024 is who's going to seal that border. Bobby Kennedy can do it. Trump can do it. Those are the people that need to be in office. And the committee running Stepford Biden, they've had us supporting this incredibly sadistic war in Ukraine, and they want to drag us into and drag all of American, treasure and our wonderful people into these wars. And that's the thing that we need to be aware of. And it is that realization, I think, right here in the ideas room about that shuts it off because it doesn't resonate here. And that's important, in all aspects of life, that realization rippling across. And, real patriotism would be sealing the border. There's no question about it.
Yeah, and I don't know how much power we have sort of to affect change. That's always in question, but we certainly have the power to respond rather than react, right? Find a place. I found listen, there's going to be a lot of tribulations coming, that's guaranteed. And, how do you want to respond to them? How do you want to feel it in your body? So that you're not coming from a place of reactivity. I've seen a lot of reactivity in the last week, understandably, and I haven't liked any of it. It doesn't feel centered.
Oh, it's like a vortex. Absolutely.
Well,
yeah.
People are, but I took a moment and I somehow I was given the gift of finding where in my body to respond to what I've been witnessing. And it felt solid when I did. It felt wise and good and trustworthy. And it wasn't reacting, it was responding. Like I was in touch with truth. And I think it's so important to do that because then you're not in a fear-based place.
Oh, absolutely. That's the difference.
Mm-hmm.
What fear is the mind killer.
Yep.
And the Cayce readings refer to this over and over again, talking about fear is an unnatural state for humanity, and fear leads humanity astray. Are you ready? Pictures of the young Thomas Jefferson that Cayce said was the reincarnation. T.J. Davis, that is him with his mom. Cayce giving the readings, telling him, you have great promise if that destiny is fulfilled. And so this is the great promise. This is Cayce, Gladys Davis, and Gertrude with T.J. Davis, Thomas Jefferson, reincarnated. And Cayce had hoped for great things for the reincarnation of Thomas Jefferson. It didn't come to pass, but he did have the incredible fortune to be there in Cayce's circle. And a couple of quick things from his reading. And of course, I'm going to do that episode directly on Thomas Jefferson's past life, and I'll include all this in there. But it says, We find in the application of this entity's experience in the present those very influences for power, if they are not merely idealistic but purposeful, with the ideals of a union for an application, will bring not only material but spiritual benefits in those activities in the earth. For the entity from those very things may become that one who may make of the world as one nation, and those of the other lands as but states in one grand kingdom. Before that, we find the entity was in the land during the periods when there were the activities that made for the rise and fall of many lands, all of the eastern lands, Grecian and Persian, when that entity was known as Alexander the Great. That's Thomas Jefferson. Absolutely fascinating. And this is the promise that we hold going into that future. And we can see Jefferson, had he fulfilled that, this might have been a major, in this reincarnation, might have been a major figure that we were talking about who had unified the world already and made America great again, as it were. It wasn't to be that time, but it's an amazing story. And I promise that I have some very interesting details about him and his life, which we'll get to. And a couple of great Cayce researchers have tackled it over the years. And I'll be bringing that forward. But of course, in his one life as Jefferson, he did a lot more than anyone could possibly imagine. And so we're all in great debt to Thomas Jefferson, our founding father of the nation. And I think there's more to be had in that story. And of course, there's the picture of Washington
Love
in
it.
his Masonic regalia, surrounded by every kind of mysticism you could possibly want. I didn't want to leave out for this episode a couple of interesting things that showed up on the radar, just on the side, but going along with this thing about, how they're going to have to change history and the things that we've brought forward about the mystery school version about Atlantis and Mu and other places. Scientists say they've confirmed evidence, this is mainstream news, that humans arrived in the Americas far earlier than previously thought. Well, they found these in white sands. And yes, those are over 25,000 years old. New Mexico footprints are oldest signs of humans in America, research shows. Fossil footprints date back to between 21 and 23,000 years ago, upending previous theory that humans reached the continent later. And so as we go and as we learn these things, and the Cayce work in particular, along with Steiner, moves closer and closer to the actual historical narrative. How long until it's ultimately surmised? Yeah, the pyramids are, 10,500 BC. Remember how old the Giza Plateau is. Here's what Cayce said about why they selected it. Well, it was already a sacred site. In fact, they were doing archaeology to find it. That was in 10,500 BC. So if they were doing archaeology then, how old is the site that they built the Great Pyramid and the pyramids and the Sphinx? Think about that as we leave here. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're done for tonight.
Okay, I've got a bunch of super chatters to thank.
Okay.
Okay, Eurythmia's Fund, The Bikini Truther, Amarillo Gunrunners, Thomas Ball, Wolfgang McCarthy, Sun Hero, Izzy the Great, Rosterman the Seer, Global Atlantis, Robert Scott, Fulcanelli, Jay Parsons, Terry Doherty, Jennifer Walters, Lisa Davey, Erica Swenson Elliott, Karen Carpenter, Copernicus, Philip K. Dick Film Festival, Belle B, Diana Brandstatter, Helena Wilcox, and Pepe Le Pew Pew. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. Wow. Incredible. And there we have Columbia stretching the telegraph lines across America back in the day, that incredible vision that they had. Thank you so much for your support, everyone. We really appreciate it. It allows us to do the work that we do here. And we're deep into Mystery October. We have some fantastic X-Series episodes coming up for you, including some very interesting things to look for at the end of October and into November as well. We'll be back with you next Friday. Before I go, let's do some shout outs here.
Before you do that, I wanted to invite anybody and everybody listening to this to add to the comment section any story where you feel like you
share your angel story.
Angel
That's
story.
it. Yeah, the angel one was
Mhm.
No, you had it right with that, because all of a sudden everybody,
Mhm.
so we weren't so alone on that one. You've had some, I've had some. of course, I had the weird mystery school person with the Pink Floyd t-shirt. We know that story. I'll never forget that one. Pepe Le Pew Pew. That's great. Okay. Thomas Ball, Jay Cameron, Corey Anderson, Esther Taylor, Harry Hunkinen, Rick, Loosh cultivation. Yeah, wasn't that very interesting? Jay Cameron, the sun is the moon and bears my seal, the Lord of this world. Fascinating. What is that from? Great show. Thank you. Finished Granite, 65. Very interesting. Katie Cat. Thank you, DJ and Olivia. It's great to have you here. Blue, great show. Thank you very much. Darcy Edmonds.
Lisa says, please tell us the Pink Floyd story.
Oh, that's a long one. I'll save it. But I will say that I was in Ohio, oddly enough.
Oh, that guy.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
When you were looking for, was it a Steiner or a Gurdjieff book?
No, it was a rare Gurdjieff book.
Okay.
But it was like 7:30 at night and he just stumbled in and started to go up the ladder in the bookstore to get me the book, and very unusual meeting. And then when he left, the guy who was selling the books was kind of disturbed about the whole thing. He's like, I've never seen that guy before. I didn't even buy anything. And he noticed that something was up with the whole thing. And I had a sense with him when he showed up, but I wasn't sure what was going on exactly. The Sphinx was first. It was buried. Exactly. Another great show, Daniel and Olivia. Thank you, Donnie Rotten. Scarlet Fire, Al Kiter. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Scarlet Fire, Al Kiter, Black Zionist, Sovereign Breton, Hot Poser. Thanks for another great show, DJ and Miss Olivia, and a reluctant good night to the most interesting collection of weirdos on YouTube. There you go. Hat Powser. Oh, okay, I get it now. Such a badass show. Ain't that the truth? Folk and Alley, Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, there's more. The Lives of Thomas Jefferson. We're going to do a very special X series episode coming up for you on that one. So this is a really kind of the prelude for the whole thing. But I thought the special report, we need to remember that patriotism in this period where they're throwing everything and that they can get their hands on at us. Bravo, says Sovereign Brehan. Olivia Wings Girl, do appreciate having this forum. Thank you. Ogum. Right on. Very good. Jen and Mammy, thank you very much. 1111. Aha, the numerology is hot tonight. Corky Goss, Bo Rip, Ted Doherty, Antisocial. Huh. Brian Storm, all kinds of interesting things going on there. You mean the 1,000 volts of prana? Yes. Good night, XFam. Najat Madri, it's great to see you out there. Wow. Whew. Fantastic faces there in the ideas room tonight. We will see you all next week. And never let it be forgot. Once there was Camelot. I had some kind of a poll with Bobby Kennedy. I was going to show it. I don't know if I might show that to close us out, but it looked pretty good for Bobby. Now, what's interesting is Trump has been leading Stepford Biden by 6 or 8 points, but there's 41-41 tie with Bobby at 16 as an independent. Pretty interesting. There's going to be a lot of dynamics there. We're going to do a special on the election coming up later in October, and we'll keep an eye out on all that. But certainly Bobby's out there. He announced his independence from the Democratic Party, and that can only be a good thing. And we'll see. It seems to me with the forces on the Trump side, the forces on the Kennedy side, they need to kind of meet up somewhere in the middle to smash the Biden regime. And hopefully that's what's happening. And maybe like Colombia, they can defend America. We will see you all next week, and never let it be forgot.
Once there was a Camelot.
And, Bobby's out there is trying hard. We will see you all next week. Have a fantastic night. And, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends.
God
see
bless
you soon.
Everybody.
Thank you very much. Great ideas from questions tonight.
Amazing.
I salute you.